My name is Nathan Mitchell, and I never thought a routine dental checkup would change my life. I'm a 28-year-old software developer living in Boston, and until that fateful appointment, my life was a predictable sequence of coding, coffee, and occasional social outings. It started with a persistent toothache that I'd been ignoring for weeks. Finally, my sister's nagging convinced me to make an appointment at a new dental practice that had opened near my apartment. Lakeside Dental had good reviews online, and they could fit me in the next day, so I booked it without much thought. Walking into the modern, well-lit office the next morning, I was immediately struck by how different it felt from the sterile, intimidating dental offices I remembered from childhood. The receptionist, a friendly woman named Marie, had me fill out some forms and assured me that Dr. Christopher Evans was excellent with nervous patients. "I'm not nervous," I protested, even as my leg bounced anxiously. She just smiled knowingly and went back to her computer. A few minutes later, a dental assistant called my name and led me to an examination room. As I settled into the chair, trying to look more relaxed than I felt, I heard a warm, deep voice behind me. "Good morning, Mr. Mitchell. I'm Dr. Evans, but please, call me Chris." I turned my head and felt my breath catch. Dr. Evans was nothing like the older, stern dentists I'd seen before. He appeared to be in his early 30s, with striking green eyes and dark brown hair that had just a touch of silver at the temples. His smile was, unsurprisingly, perfect. "Nathan," I managed to say. "You can call me Nathan." He sat down on the rolling stool beside me, and I caught a subtle hint of his cologne, something woodsy and elegant. "So, Nathan, what brings you in today?" As I explained my toothache, he listened attentively, occasionally making notes on his tablet. When I finished, he pulled on his gloves and mask, but his eyes stayed focused on mine. "Let's take a look, shall we? Try to relax. I promise I'll be gentle." Something about the way he said those words made my heart rate spike. And I was grateful the blood pressure cuff wasn't attached yet. As he reclined the chair and adjusted the light, I closed my eyes, trying to calm my suddenly racing pulse. "Open for me, please," he instructed softly. I complied, and he began his examination. His touch professional but surprisingly gentle. Despite my usual anxiety about dental procedures, I found myself relaxing under his care. He murmured as he worked. "I can see what's bothering you. You've got a cavity that needs attention, and your wisdom teeth are starting to cause some crowding. When was your last dental visit?" I admitted it had been longer than it should have been. He clicked his tongue disapprovingly, though his eyes crinkled with amusement above his mask. "Well, we'll need to schedule you for a filling, and we should discuss those wisdom teeth. How's your schedule looking next week?" I found myself scheduling 2 appointments for the following week, one for the filling and another for a consultation about my wisdom teeth. As I left the office, I caught myself checking my reflection in the window, running a hand through my dark blonde hair and straightening my shirt. I tried to tell myself I was just being professional, but deep down, I knew I was already looking forward to seeing Dr. Evans again. The week seemed to drag until my next appointment. When I arrived for the filling, Chris, as he'd insisted I call him, greeted me with that same warm smile that made my stomach do flips. "How's the tooth been?" he asked as he helped me get settled in the chair. "Better, though I'm still having some sensitivity," I replied, trying not to focus on how close he was standing. "We'll take care of that today," he assured me. His assistant, Sarah, began preparing the equipment while he explained the procedure to me. I was only half listening, distracted by the way his hands moved as he talked. "Are you comfortable?" he asked, placing a gentle hand on my shoulder. The touch, though brief, sent electricity through my body. "Yes," I managed, though my heart was racing. "Good. You'll feel a little pinch from the anesthetic, but just raise your left hand if you need me to stop at any point." As he worked, he kept up a steady stream of gentle conversation, asking about my job and life between instructions to open wider or close slightly. His hands were incredibly skilled, and despite my usual dental anxiety, I found myself completely at ease. "You develop software?" he asked as he waited for the anesthetic to take effect. "That's fascinating. I actually considered going into tech before deciding on dentistry." "Why dentistry?" I asked, genuinely curious. He paused, considering. "I like the idea of helping people, of course, but I also enjoy the precision it requires. Plus," he added with a slight laugh, "I get to make people smile." The procedure went smoothly, and before I knew it, he was telling me we were finished. As he removed his mask and gloves, I caught another whiff of that intoxicating cologne. "Everything looks good," he said, making some notes on my chart. "How are you feeling?" "A bit numb," I admitted, trying not to drool. He chuckled and handed me a tissue. "That's normal. The numbness should wear off in a few hours. Try to avoid eating until then." He paused, then added, "I'll see you next week for the wisdom teeth consultation." I nodded, perhaps a bit too eagerly. As I was checking out, I overheard him talking to Sarah about lunch plans. "I'll probably just grab something from that new cafe down the street," he was saying. I knew the place he meant. It was actually one of my favorite lunch spots. For the rest of the day, I couldn't stop thinking about possibly running into him there sometime, away from the professional setting of his office. The week until my next appointment passed even more slowly than the first. I found myself taking lunch at that cafe every day, telling myself I wasn't really hoping to see him there. On Thursday, my wishful thinking paid off. I was just settling into my usual corner table with my sandwich when I heard that now familiar voice. "Nathan." I looked up to find Chris standing there, holding a coffee cup and wearing a navy blue button-down that made his green eyes seem even more striking. He was without his usual lab coat, and I couldn't help but notice how well his clothes fit his athletic frame. "Mind if I join you?" he asked, gesturing to the empty chair across from me. "Please," I said, probably too quickly, moving my laptop aside to make room. He sat down, and for a moment, neither of us seemed to know quite what to say. It felt strange seeing him in this context, away from the dental office. "So," he finally said, "is this your usual lunch spot?" "Yeah, I work just a few blocks away," I replied, trying to sound casual. "The software company I'm with has an office nearby. It's becoming one of my favorites too," he said, unwrapping his own sandwich, "though I don't get out of the office for lunch as often as I'd like." We fell into easy conversation, discussing everything from our favorite local restaurants to our thoughts on the latest Marvel movies. I learned that he had moved to Boston 2 years ago after completing his residency in Chicago, that he had a golden retriever named Max, and that he loved skiing, but was terrible at it. "I spend more time falling than actually skiing," he admitted with a self-deprecating laugh that made my heart skip. "I could teach you," I offered before I could stop myself. "I used to be an instructor during college." His eyes lit up. "Really? That would be amazing. Though," he added with a slight smirk, "I'm not sure if it's ethical for me to let my patient teach me to ski. What if I crash into you and damage those teeth I just fixed?" The playful tone in his voice made me bold. "Well, at least I'd know a good dentist." He laughed, and I noticed how his eyes crinkled at the corners when he did. Our lunch hour stretched to nearly 2 before he reluctantly checked his watch. "I should get back," he said, standing. "I have a patient at 2. He hesitated for a moment, then added, "I enjoyed this, Nathan." "Me too," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. As he turned to leave, he paused. "You know, there's a dental conference in New Hampshire next weekend at one of the ski resorts. Actually, maybe we could test out those instructor skills of yours." My heart practically leapt out of my chest. That would be great. "Perfect. We can discuss the details at your consultation tomorrow." His eyes held mine for a moment longer than strictly necessary. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. That night, I could barely focus on anything. Was this just a friendly offer? Professional networking? Or something more? The way he looked at me suggested the latter, but I didn't want to read too much into it. The next day, I arrived at my consultation 5 minutes early, my stomach in knots. The wisdom teeth discussion was brief, they needed to come out. But it wasn't urgent. Chris suggested we could schedule the surgery for after ski season. Wouldn't want to ruin your weekend plans, he said with a knowing smile. The following weekend, I found myself driving up to New Hampshire, my ski gear packed and my nerves on edge. Chris had texted me the hotel details and suggested meeting in the lobby at 8 a.m. He'd mentioned that while he did have one conference session to attend in the afternoon, his morning was free for skiing lessons. I arrived at the resort the night before, barely sleeping from anticipation. When I walked into the lobby the next morning, I spotted him immediately. He was wearing fitted ski pants and a blue thermal layer that highlighted his broad shoulders. His usual professional demeanor was replaced by a more relaxed, casual energy that made him even more attractive. "Nathan," he called out, waving me over. "I was worried you might change your mind about teaching the world's worst skier." "Never," I replied, trying to ignore how good he looked. Ready to hit the slopes. We picked up our equipment and headed to the bunny slope. As we rode the ski lift together, our shoulders touching in the narrow seat, Chris turned to me. "I should probably tell you something," he said, suddenly serious. "I've been thinking about this weekend a lot. And, well, I want to be clear that I don't typically socialize with patients." My heart sank for a moment before he continued. "But I can't stop thinking about you, Nathan, and not in a professional way." He looked at me intently. "If that makes you uncomfortable, we can forget I said anything and keep this strictly a skiing lesson." The lift was nearing the top, but I gathered my courage. "I can't stop thinking about you either," I admitted. His answering smile was brighter than the sun reflecting off the snow. As we dismounted the lift, he deliberately brushed his gloved hand against mine. The next few hours were a mixture of actual ski instruction and barely disguised flirting. Chris was a better skier than he'd claimed, though he did take a few dramatic falls that required my hands-on assistance to get up. By lunchtime, we were both pink-cheeked from more than just the cold. "I have that conference session at 2, Chris said as we sat in the lodge with hot chocolate. "But would you have dinner with me tonight? There's a nice restaurant in the hotel." "I'd love to," I replied, trying to contain my excitement. "Great, and Nathan?" He leaned closer. "I'll make sure to request a table far from any other dentists. I'd rather not have to explain to my colleagues why I'm on a date with a patient." My heart leapt at the word date. "Is that what this is?" I asked, feeling bold. "I hope so," he said softly, "unless you have ethical concerns about dating your dentist." I pretended to consider it. "Well, I suppose I could always find a new dentist, though it would be a shame. My current one is exceptionally gentle with his hands." His eyes darkened slightly at that, and he checked his watch. "I have an hour before my session. Want to do one more run?" Our final run down the slopes was charged with anticipation. Every time Chris needed my help with his form, the touches lingered longer than necessary. By the time we returned to the lodge, the tension between us was palpable. "I should go get ready for my session," he said reluctantly. "Meet me in the hotel restaurant at 7? I spent the afternoon alternating between relaxing in the hotel spa and agonizing over what to wear. I finally settled on dark jeans and a charcoal sweater that my sister always said brought out my blue eyes. When I arrived at the restaurant, Chris was already waiting at the bar. He had changed into a crisp white shirt and a navy blazer, and the sight of him made my mouth go dry. He stood as I approached, his eyes traveling appreciatively over my outfit. "You look amazing," he said softly, leading me to our table in a quiet corner. The restaurant was dimly lit, with candles creating an intimate atmosphere. As we settled into our seats, Chris ordered a bottle of red wine. "How was your conference session?" I asked, trying to maintain some semblance of normal conversation despite the electricity crackling between us. "Honestly, I barely heard a word," he admitted. "I was too busy thinking about tonight." The wine arrived, And as Chris took a sip, I watched the way his throat moved. He caught me staring and smiled. "You know," he said, "I've never done this before. Dated a patient. Is that what we're doing? Dating?" He reached across the table and took my hand. "I'd like to, though, as I said, you might need to find a new dentist." "Worth it," I replied, squeezing his hand. Our dinner conversation flowed easily, moving from work stories to childhood memories to future dreams. I learned that he'd come out to his family in dental school, that he loved cooking but was terrible at baking, and that he'd always wanted to travel to New Zealand. "What about you?" he asked. "Any dream destinations?" "Italy," I replied. "I've always wanted to see Rome." "We should go sometime," he said, then immediately looked embarrassed. "Sorry, that's probably getting way ahead of ourselves." "I don't mind," I assured him, loving how flustered he looked. As we finished our wine, Chris's hand found mine again. "Would you like to take a walk? The resort has some lovely paths around the lake." Outside, the night was clear and cold, stars twinkling above us. We walked close together, our shoulders brushing, until we reached a quiet spot overlooking the water. Chris turned to face me, and in the moonlight, his eyes seemed to glow. "Nathan," he said softly, reaching up to cup my face, "I'm going to kiss you now, if that's okay." Instead of answering, I closed the distance between us. His lips were soft and warm against mine, and he tasted faintly of wine. The kiss started gentle but quickly deepened, months of built-up tension finally finding release. His hands moved to my waist, pulling me closer, while mine tangled in his hair. When we finally broke apart, both slightly breathless, Chris rested his forehead against mine. "I've been wanting to do that since the first time you walked into my office," he confessed. "Even with my cavity?" I teased. He laughed, pulling me closer. "Even with your cavity, though I have to say, your oral hygiene has improved significantly under my care." Well, I had motivation to impress my dentist. We stayed by the lake for a while longer, trading kisses and conversation until the cold became too much to ignore. As we walked back to the hotel, hand in hand, Chris suddenly stopped. "Stay with me tonight," he asked softly, "just to talk and be together. No pressure for anything more." My heart raced as I nodded. His room was on a higher floor than mine, with a stunning view of the mountains. But I barely noticed the scenery, too focused on the way Chris was looking at me as he closed the door behind us. He pulled me into another kiss, this one slower and more deliberate than our lakeside embrace. His hand slid under my sweater, warm against my skin, and I shivered. "Is this okay?" he murmured against my lips. "More than okay," I assured him. We spent the night talking, kissing, and eventually falling asleep in each other's arms. When I woke the next morning to find Chris watching me with soft eyes, I knew this was more than just attraction. "Good morning," he said, pressing a kiss to my forehead. "Sleep well?" "Better than I have in ages," I replied, snuggling closer. Over room service breakfast, we discussed what would happen when we returned to Boston. Chris had already researched other dental practices he could refer me to. "Wanting to do everything properly. I want to do this right," he explained. "No ethical gray areas, no complications, just us." The next few weeks were a whirlwind of dates, stolen kisses, and getting to know each other outside the dental office. Chris took me to his favorite restaurants, and I introduced him to my favorite hiking spots. We spent lazy Sundays with his dog, Max, who immediately decided I was his new favorite person. 1 month after the ski trip, I had my last appointment with Chris as his patient, a final checkup before transferring to my new dentist. As I sat in his chair for the last time, we both couldn't help but laugh at how different things were from my first visit. "Open wide," he said with a wink, making me roll my eyes. After declaring my teeth perfectly healthy, he removed his gloves and mask. "Well, Mr. Mitchell, I believe this concludes our professional relationship." "Thank goodness," I replied, pulling him down for a kiss. 6 months after our ski weekend, Chris and I had fallen into a comfortable rhythm together. We spent most nights at his place, which was larger and had the added bonus of Max's company. I had gradually moved enough of my belongings over that I had my own drawer in half his closet. One Sunday morning, as we lay tangled in his sheets, Chris propped himself up on an elbow and looked at me seriously. "Move in with me," he said. It wasn't exactly a question, but his eyes were uncertain. "Are you sure?" I asked, though my heart was already racing with excitement. "I've never been more sure of anything," he replied, tracing patterns on my chest. "This place feels empty when you're not here. Even Max gets depressed when you leave." "Well, we can't have Max getting depressed," I teased, pulling him down for a kiss. Moving in together was surprisingly seamless. Our styles complemented each other perfectly. His minimalist tendencies balanced my more eclectic taste. We established a routine. Morning runs with Max. Shared cooking duties, though Chris was banned from baking after one particularly disastrous attempt at cookies. And quiet evenings together. Chris's colleagues at the dental practice quickly grew used to seeing me at office parties and events, not as a patient, but as his partner. Sarah, his dental assistant, told me she had known from my first appointment that something was different. The way he kept finding excuses to check on your tooth personally instead of letting me do it. She laughed. I'd never seen him so attentive to a simple cavity. 1 year after our first ski lesson, we returned to the same resort in New Hampshire. This time, Chris was actually a decent skier, though he still pretended to need my help occasionally. After a day on the slopes, we returned to our spot by the lake. The stars were just as bright as that first night, and the air was filled with the same magical possibility. "You know," Chris said, pulling me close, "a year ago, I was standing here, terrified that I was about to ruin everything by kissing my patient. And now?" I asked. "Now, I'm standing here terrified for a different reason," he replied, reaching into his pocket. As he dropped to one knee, my heart stopped. "Nathan Mitchell," he said, his voice shaking slightly, "this past year has been the happiest of my life. You've made me laugh more, love more, and even ski better than I ever thought possible." He opened a small box, revealing a platinum band. "Will you marry me?" Through my tears, I managed to say, "Yes," pulling him up into a kiss. As he slipped the ring onto my finger, I couldn't help but laugh. "What's so funny?" he asked, still holding me close. "Just thinking about how glad I am I got that cavity," I replied. "Best dental problem I've ever had." Chris hesitated, then gave me a sheepish look. "I should probably tell you something," he admitted. "That first checkup, your cavity wasn't actually that bad. I may have slightly exaggerated the need for immediate treatment just so I could see you again." "Dr. Evans," I gasped in mock horror. "How unprofessional." "Totally worth it," he murmured, pulling me in for another kiss. And there, under the same stars that had witnessed our first kiss, we began planning our future together. All because of one slightly exaggerated cavity and a dentist who couldn't help falling for his patient.